Get started. We haven't had very many folks join the last minute or two, so we're going to start this webinar. Welcome to the PSAC Prairies webinar, Returning to Work Following the Pandemic. And let's face it, we're actually not we're not done with the pandemic. We're still in it, unfortunately. For the foreseeable future. What we're going to do tonight is spend about an hour with you. We've got some presentations. We have opportunity for questions towards the end. We're going to try and stick to around the hour to get you on with your evening. And if there's any questions that require some additional follow-up, we can figure out a way to do that off of the webinar. So again, if you have any questions, technical questions, if you can put them in the chat box, that would be great. Any questions that you have throughout the presentations, if you can type them into the question box. And if we need to, we can come back for some more detail with you a little bit later. Also, we're going to have an interactive couple of polls. We're going to want you to be involved. We're going to ask you questions. We're going to ask you to type in the question box so that we can, get your input on some of the things that might be happening in your workplace. During the presentation, we're going to keep everyone muted. So we'll have to unmute you to ask your question later, just so that you know. We automatically will mute you, just so that there's no, fears of that for right now. Okay, so I'm going to ask Marianne, Martha, and Clint to all join me up here. There they are. Okay. So tonight we have presenting Martha Johnson. So Martha, say hello. There she is. Martha is a regional rep from the Winnipeg office, a new transplant to Manitoba from Saskatchewan, from Regina. We also have Clint Worth, who is our regional health and safety representative. You probably have recognized Clint. His face will be recognizable. He's been pretty steady on the webinar circuit these last little while. And so he'll be actually presenting some more of our technical information a bit later. And I know that you're going to have lots of questions for him. And we also have Marianne Haldoon, who is the Regional Executive Vice President for the Prairie region. Also a seasoned webinar circuit attender. Thanks, Marianne. So we're going to actually have Marianne provide us with some opening remarks right now, as well as our land acknowledgement. So we're going to hand it over to Marianne.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. For those who've been on webinars the last few weeks, I'm no longer green. I, for some reason, had a green camera tinge, so webcam it is. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge that myself here, we are gathered in Treaty 1 territory, and that the land is the traditional territory of the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The Public Service Alliance of Canada is dedicated to ensuring that the spirit of reconciliation and Treaty 1 is honored and respected. PSAC respects the treaties that were made on these territories, acknowledges the harms and mistakes of the past, and dedicates to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So for tonight's webinar, I'm not even sure what number it is. We started these in March around health and safety, and then kind of expanded it just to, on topics that, while people are at home, that might be of interest and based on suggestions and recommendations from members. But the one thing that we are getting a lot of questions about is, what does a return to work look like? And keep in mind, we have Treasury Board and federal agencies, but we've also got members in private employers, in casinos, at universities, all over the place. So we won't be able to address specific situations, but this will give you a bit of an idea of what that might look like. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and I will turn it back to the presenters to start the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne. So we're just going to start the evening off with a little poll to get you warmed up. It's not going to be too difficult. The first question is a simple one. It's where are you located in the Prairie region? So we're only allowed 5 answers, otherwise I would have been a bit more creative. So Manitoba, Southern Alberta, Southern Saskatchewan, Northern Saskatchewan. And we also want to recognize that there's probably a lot of guests from outside of our region checking in what we're doing here tonight. So for the rest of the PSAC membership or other staff from across the country, welcome. Sorry, we don't have a little spot for you. Okay, so it looks like everyone's voted here. Who's going to, okay, there's only 62% of you that's actually voted. So I'm just gonna give you another minute or so, moment I should say. And I'm gonna close the poll. Okay. So here are the results. Okay, we have a good chunk from Manitoba and then followed up by Northern Alberta. There we go. So that's who we have in the room. I'm gonna just pass it over to Martha Johnson here to get us started with the first presentation. Thanks, Martha.
Thanks, Tracy. So hi, everyone. We are talking about returning to work or contemplated returning to work. So as everybody's noticed across the prairies, things are opening up. Minimum numbers permitted for gatherings, both indoor and outdoors, have increased, though we are still maintaining social distancing measures. So it's busier out there. You know, if you're, I don't know, I've heard from some people that if you go to the liquor store, the lineups are really long to get in now. And then in the grocery store, we're still following the little footprints and following the arrows. You may be the guy that, or the lady or person that is in the aisle and going in the exact opposite direction of those arrows sometimes. So, you know, there's a lot of movement happening. Salons are starting to open up. Dental offices are starting to open up again. Gyms, we just heard this week, are going to open again in June. So really, as we get more information about this virus, things continue to evolve. So the only thing that we can really count on at this point in time is that change is going to be the constant. So the same thing is going to apply in our workplaces. That is going to remain different for the foreseeable future. So contemplating, again, returning to work, we want to get a sense of what your comfort level is with returning to the office. So Tracy's going to do a second poll for us. If you want to open that second poll, Tracy. Okay,
yeah,
fantastic.
there it is. Yeah. Okay, so the second poll is, how comfortable do you feel about physically heading back into the workplace? So we know that some people have remained at work. We realize that some were fortunate enough to be at home and remained working. And unfortunately, we do have some PSAC members who've been laid off and hopefully are returning to work soon. So are you ready? Can't happen soon enough. I'm ready, but my home situation will make it difficult. I'm nervous. I think we're rushing the reopening. Are you terrified? Rarely left the house? Or that you've remained working in the workplace this entire time and have been one of the frontline workers?
So Tracy, it's Clint. Going through the questions to this point, a few people have noted that they haven't been able to answer the poll question. One possible solution is once you've made your selection, you need to click submit. That if you're on a tablet or phone, it's usually on the top right-hand side. So that might be one of the issues why your vote isn't being accepted.
Great, thank you, Clint. Okay, we're doing better, folks. 70% have, so 72% have voted. So it's like people are waking up and they're back from their getting their drinks.
Okay, so I'll just take a moment to say that Before Tracy reveals the results of the poll, I want to acknowledge that everyone is going to be in a different place with this return to work idea. And, you know, we have different circumstances in our personal lives, so it's just very important for us to be respectful and mindful of one another's differences.
Okay, thanks, Martha. Okay, so I'm just getting a couple of moments here, close this poll. 85% have voted, so that's pretty good. Hopefully those voting issues have been resolved. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll now. And Martha, here is the results.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we have 17% that are saying, I'm ready, it can't happen soon enough. And I think even those of us that are answering in different categories can relate to that. You know, we are human beings, we are not solitary creatures, we thrive on human interaction. So we know what it's like to not feel so great about being isolated. For those of you that answered B, I'm ready, but my home situation is going to make it difficult. That's a really valid point for a lot of people. You know, you may be ready to go back to work or have an opportunity to go back to work, but as many of us know, those of us with children, school-aged or otherwise, schools are not necessarily following the same schedule for reopening, and so that's going to present education challenges as well as daycare challenges. You know, we've also got family members who may be frail or for whom we provide personal care services like grocery shopping. So that's going to impact them as well. So yeah, a lot of logistics come into play for us to just up and go back to work. For those of you that answered C and D, our hope is that this webinar is going to answer some of your questions and address some of your concerns, and hopefully as Clint goes through some of the more in-depth information later on, some of your fears around returning to work will be alleviated. And I just want, for those of you that have remained in the workplace, just a hats off to those of you out there who have not been fortunate enough to work from home or have been on the front lines this whole time. You have our gratitude and respect. So, but I just want to again emphasize that however you're feeling about this, it's okay. This is a huge first kind of event of this nature that any of us have had in most of our lifetimes. So it's fine to feel however you do. On the employer side of the fence, obviously, they also have huge considerations. They're currently in discussion, making plans to resume operations, to bring you back to work, and all of this is being done with a view to keeping you safe. Employers should be, and in many cases are consulting with unions and workplace health and safety committees. And right now, some departments, federal departments, are actually contacting members, and they're saying, so hey, you know, Susan, if I were to bring you back to work on this day at this time, what's that look like for you? How does that feel? So you're going to need to consider what you need going back into the workplace. How does it look for you to return? So for instance, how do you go in and out of the workplace? How do your clients or the people that you service go in and out of your establishment? How many staff are in there? Your personal workstation. Do you work alone in a little cubicle, or maybe you work in a pod with 2 or 3 other people? And office equipment, who's using that? Who's got hands-on with all of that stuff? For those of you that actually sit on your workplace local executive or workplace health and safety committees, you'll probably want to be getting into discussions or giving it a little bit deeper thought into something like, you know, maybe with the X number of people that we have in this workplace, we might need to do shift work. And then, of course, personal protective equipment is something that you'll also want to consider. Again, for you, those of you on executives and committees, please don't forget to use your peers that have remained in the workplace this whole time as a resource. They've got valuable input into what works and what doesn't because they've been there the whole time. So if you have ideas about what could benefit your workplace to help maintain social distancing through the return to work process, please share them with your local union executive and your workplace health and safety committee. And on that note, we're going to do another poll. So if Tracy, if you could launch that for me, please.
Okay, sorry about that, Martha.
That's okay. Okay, so do you have access to current contact information for your local union executive and or your workplace health and safety committee?
Okay, so your answer is the easy one this time. It's a yes or a no. So I'd like to see all 140 plus members who are or participants on this to actually answer this question. Let's see if we can get our percentage up there. So I'll give you a few moments. And I just checked with Clinton. We're not sure why it's so it works for some people sometimes and doesn't work for others the other time.
Yep.
We're not really
And we
sure
have 100% of voters. Okay.
Let me close the poll here, and I'll share the results.
Yay, that's fantastic. Okay, I'm really happy to see how many of you actually have contact for those people. So that's really good news. For those of you that don't, if you don't know how to reach out to your union executive or health and safety people, Tracy is going to post the numbers for all of our Prairies regional offices in the chat box. And don't forget our website is a valuable resource for information as it happens. And again, I just want to please contact us so that we have your current contact information. Before I pass it over to Clint, the last thing I'm going to say to you is that when it comes to returning to work, maintaining social distancing, we all have a role to play. So perhaps, you know, the employer may be responsible to provide you with personal protective equipment, but you may return to work and find that you're now facing scheduled breaks in order to control the flow of traffic in and out of the office. And so that may be a shift for you, but it's our responsibility to cooperate with the protocols and processes that are put in place and just do our part to contribute to community health and safety and workplace health and safety. Thank you, and take it away, Clint.
Okay, thank you. There we go. Sorry, slides kind of flipped ahead a little bit there. So for those of you might have noticed, I gave you a different wall to look at this time. So what we're going to be talking about today is what does a return to work situation look like? Just a couple caveats before we get started, a couple notes to make. Most importantly, just a reminder of what I've said for a number of different webinars. As PSAC staff, we can offer advice, we can offer support, we can offer resources, we can offer, you know, all sorts of guidance, those kinds of things. But when it comes to any sort of workplace resolution, we need to refer back to the local and the component as respecting the PSAC structure. They have the ability to address workplace concerns with the workplace that I don't have the ability to do. The other caveat I'll kind of mention as we go before we get started is you're going to notice some of my comments are a little wishy-washy, generic, general, and that's unfortunate. But there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because if we're making plans, you know, a month down the road, 2 months down the road, 3 months down the road, it's really hard to predict what the pandemic is going to look like during that period of time. So whatever kind of plans or suggestions we make really has to be flexible and provide a framework as opposed to a hard and fast resolution. The other challenge with that is going to be, as Marianne mentioned in her opening statement, that we have so many different workplaces doing so many different types of work with so many different kinds of setups. It's really hard to kind of provide a one-size-fits-all response and guidance for you know, what's going to happen in a lot of workplaces. So what I've designed in my presentation that'll take about 15-20 minutes to go through is raising some questions that you should be asking your employer, things that you should be aware of, and so that you're well informed, so that when the employer does come back to you with some sort of idea of what a return to work is going to look like, whenever that is, you'll have some ability to ask some questions and be informed to make sure that the employer has taken everything into consideration. And then you'll note that the national website recently posted a return to workplace plan and some suggestions. Just a note that my webinar was done first. The national is following me. So we continue to be trendsetters in the Prairie region.
Woo, Clint.
So just a little fun slide to get us started off. This is what some people think working from home right now looks like, where you're just sitting on the couch and using your broom to push buttons. We know that's not the reality in our workplaces right now. I know for a lot of people in discussions that working from home and teleworking has been even more of a challenge and even harder to do than if they were in the office. So I just wanted to start off with a funny note. You'll see a few humorous pictures as we go along. So some of the potential new realities that I can foresee us having to deal with and address are listed above, are on your screen. So most importantly, I think we're going to see an increased sanitation in workplaces, especially high contact and shared surfaces. A lot more attention in our workplace is going to be paying attention to the overall sanitary conditions of our workplaces. We're also going to have to look at increased distance between workstations, even though there's been a loosening of restrictions and workplaces might be opening while there's still restrictions in place. We'll have to look at making sure we maintain some of those distance requirements and guidelines that the provincial regulations have been providing. So even if we're back to work, there's going to be a new reality where there still needs to be space maintained, and we're going to look at some things that might accomplish that. I think one thing that will come out of this whole pandemic is a reevaluation of more permanent telework situations. I think some workplaces were really hesitant about the teleworking situation and how it would work. Now that people that have been teleworking have been doing it for a while, I think it illustrates that there's a lot of work that can be accomplished remotely. And maybe those teleworking situations that are temporary, maybe they need to be on a more permanent basis or a more flexible rotating basis. I think there's going to be a new evaluation of how we work in general. We've learned through webinars and through Skype meetings and Zoom sessions, those kinds of things, that we can have meetings without those personal interactions that can cause some areas of concern for people. A lot of people in a small room can certainly raise people's concerns. So I think there's going to be a lot more changing how we work and evaluating how we work to minimizing those personal interactions and limiting potential spread of the virus. I think generally speaking, you're going to see a different approach to sick leave, where employers are going to value, if somebody's ill, they can stay home. So there's a value in not spreading and making everybody else sick that I don't know was there in all workplaces before. Even recently with the federal government, they've put out the mandate that they want everybody to have 10 days of sick leave. Not sure what that's going to look like or anything like that, but that's kind of going along that process where everybody should have sick leave to be able to use it when they need it, to protect themselves and to protect others. I think you're also going to see some cross-training. So if somebody's not in the office, either because of illness, because they're teleworking, that there's the ability for people to fill in for other people while they're away. One of the big things that we'll talk about throughout my presentation here is increased screening. One of the things I think you'll see in a lot of workplaces is screening both for staff as they arrive to work and for visitors as they come into the workplace looking for assistance or answers, those kinds of things. Or in just the normal interactions that people may have with visitors or our clients. I think in a number of our workplaces, we're going to see an increased reliance and an increased use of personal protective equipment, PPE, and additional safety precautions that we hadn't seen there before. A lot of people on this webinar might work in an office setting and never had to deal with PPE. There's going to be a change in that where I think, even office spaces will have to have some forms of PPE in the workplace available and provided by the employer, as Martha mentioned. And generally speaking, one of the things I've noticed in the past few months is health and safety is back in the forefront of workplace concerns. You know, doing my job before, I always kind of felt like, you know, you'd get a group of people paying attention to health and safety stuff. Now we have so many more people that I've never heard from before, all of a sudden, you know, having an interest and a vested interest in health and safety because it is so important in our workplaces right now. So this next slide, each of these bullets, I'm going to go through in more detail, so I won't cover them off too much at this outset, but we'll certainly explore a little more as we have our conversation. So what should employers be considering right now? First thing is they should be considering where they get their guidance from. Really important as we gather information and use it to form our decisions. Employers should be involving the employees in the discussion. So we're going to talk about the role of the Health and Safety Committee, the Health and Safety Representative, and the local executive on that process. How will the employer monitor the workplace and change its directions? As we saw when the pandemic first started really becoming a significant issue, there was constant changes and new information, and it felt like, to me anyway, that new information was coming out on an hourly basis sometimes, if not a daily basis. So we really need to be flexible because I anticipate, you know, changes, you know, occurring as people return to the workplace as well. You'll learn from those experiences and learn about changes you need to make that you didn't think of before. Pre-screening, that's going to be a big one. We'll look at what some workplaces that are doing right now around screening, both with employees and visitors, to provide some examples on that. We'll have a bit of a discussion on what personal protective equipment and workplace modifications will be needed in some of our workplaces. We'll briefly touch on current policies and how they need to be updated and changed in the light of this new pandemic and adjusting to things that we've learned as we go along. And probably the biggest one and the most, the one that I get asked the most is around the duty to accommodate situations. So if you've got a family status situation or a personal health issue that raises concerns around returning to the workplace and reintegrating into the workplace, we'll have a bit of discussion around how that's going to work, what that's going to look like, how we're going to handle those types of situations. Another quick little picture. Tracy Thor, by the way, did not understand this joke at all. So just, you know, if you want to tease her about that,
Shame.
Go ahead.
It is totally true. I'm not a movie person that way.
But you don't even have to see the movie to get the joke. And the joke is, you know, people worried about things not opening and getting back to normal. Jurassic Park opened 5 times after people got eaten alive. So if Jurassic Park can open 5 times after something like that, I think our workplaces will do just fine reopening.
Hey, Clint, before you go on, I just want to make a quick mention here that for those of you that have your hand up, just to let you know, we're not going to be asking you to your question right now. If you want to just put your question in the question box, then we can get to it towards the end. Thanks, Clint.
Okay, thanks. So some of the areas that workplaces should be looking for guidance. The most obvious ones are the Public Health Agency of Canada, provincial or territorial governments, as well as local health authorities in your region. You can get a lot of useful information from a variety of different sources. Employers, workplaces, and union representatives should also be looking at outside organizations, such as the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety that I've referenced in a number of webinars, as well as provincial safe work bodies that often provide all sorts of good, useful information, resources, and tools to help educate people and help provide information to make good choices and good decisions. One of the recommendations I got from a session I attended with the Ontario Bar Association was that employers should be seeking legal counsel on top of those other organizations, just to make sure that what they're doing is on solid legal ground. And as well, workplaces should be bringing in experts where needed to provide technical guidance. There's sections of the Canada Labour Code and the provincial legislations that all provide the opportunity for workplace committees or health and safety representatives to ask for technical guidance to be supplied, to have somebody, an outside organization, to come in and evaluate the workplace and provide recommendations. Myself, I'm not the expert on this kind of stuff. I don't know how tall plexiglass needs to be. I don't know what kind of masks need to be used in certain circumstances, those kinds of things. There are people that do have that technical wherewithal to be able to provide that specific guidance depending on the work that you do. So it's my suggestion that workplaces should be consulting guidance from technical supports and those experts when needed. What you don't want to do is take advice from the lady on the right there that looks like she's in Walmart wearing a snorkel and snorkel mask and thinking that's going to help out. That's not the kind of person you're going to ask for support and guidance on.
Oh my God, Clint, this is exactly the picture I was talking about. That I thought was Martha.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Wait a minute, you guys, I can't see it.
Okay, next time. So around, follow up a little bit on the guidance end. Employers should be looking at more than one source. I've seen employers like, okay, this is what the province is telling us. That's good enough. That's good to go. I'm saying that shouldn't be good enough, that you should be exploring a bunch of different avenues for input and coming up with a consensus on what is the best practices for your workplace. Provincial guidance is often going to be the clearest just because it's regularly updated specific to the area that you work and live in. If you are working the federally legislated workplaces, should still be consulting the provincial and local guidelines. And if you work in a provincially legislated workplace, then you should be consulting the provincial legislation and the federal. Again, what you want to do is gather the best information from a number of different sources to make the best plan going forward. Plans must be workplace and region specific. Especially in the federal public service, what we often see is, information coming down at a national level, and it's not really flexible or, applicable to a certain region. A good example of that would be what's happening in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba right now is different than what's happening in Ontario or Quebec. So the directions and the plans need to take that sort of difference into account. As I mentioned at the outset, whatever plans are generated and we come up with, they need to be flexible and fluid. Information is going to change. We need to base our plans on the latest information. So they should be flexible. They should be open to change. And I think employees too that are in the workplace need to be understanding of that, so that when there's changes coming forward, that they can trust their employer, that they're not just doing it randomly, they're basing it on the latest information and the latest guidance that they have. One of the really good links around that I've provided there below. I'll also provide this link in the follow-up email. And this is from the Canadian Centre for Occupational Safety. There's about 16 different guides specific to the type of industries that people may work in. This resource will provide specific information based on the kind of work that you do. So if you work in an office setting, there's a guide for that. If you work in industrial, there's a guide for that. If you work in food processing, I believe there's a guide for that, specific to the kind of work that you do and specific to the types of concerns that happen in those types of workplace. And then the last piece of advice I would give to any employers is go with the most cautious approach when in doubt. You're going to get all this information from a variety of sources. Go with the most cautious approach. Don't cut corners. Don't try and minimize any threats. When in doubt, be as cautious as you can. One of the things we've talked about in a number of different webinars that we've done, but it's worth noting here, is the role of consultation and participation of employees and employee representatives in decisions and the plans that are made in the workplaces. So specifically with health and safety committees and health and safety representatives, depending on the size of the workplace, they have a legal right to participate and be consulted on any changes that may affect the health and safety of employees. So that could be the plans, that could be the implementation of the plans, that could be the development of the plans. What you see there is the Canada Labour Code Part 2 quotes If you're provincially legislated and you need the provincial quotes, email me, contact me if you can't find those in your provincial legislation, and I'll show you where it says that as well. My opinion is also that local union representatives should also be consulted for input on planning and implementation. From my experience, just talking to union activists over the past couple of weeks, it sounds like that's what's happening. There's a number of departments that are forming committees made up of union representatives and employer representatives to come up with a plan that works for their workplace. That's the kind of stuff that I would like to see in workplaces, that consultative approach where there's discussions, where union representatives and health and safety committee members have the ability to participate, be consulted, and provide input on any potential changes, plans, or anything else going on in the workplace that might affect the health and safety. What I've noticed is where that consultation doesn't occur, that's where you're going to see a lack of buy-in. You're going to see employees question the employer, not value the decisions that have been made. You're going to see some pushback, especially as people are reintegrated into the workplace. My opinion is that we're going to see a number of right to refuse situations if circumstances and hazards haven't been properly addressed in that consultation process. I'm not going to talk about the right to refuse too much, but there is a handout that's included. You'll find it if you're on a laptop or a PC. You'll find it on the right-hand side in the toolbar. If you're on a tablet or a phone, you'll usually find that as a drop-down menu. If you can't find that, that's fine. Once we've recorded this webinar, we put it on the PSAC Prairie's website, and we'll put the recording, the slides, and all the handouts there if you can't get them. So if you're searching around, can't find them, don't worry about it. We'll make sure that you have the ability to find that after. And then lastly, as I mentioned in the previous slide, any decisions or directions at a national level, they still need to be considered at a worksite level. So if you've got this national policy, what you need to do is each worksite and workplace needs to evaluate that policy and that plan and see how it fits in with that specific worksite. So there still needs to be that workplace, that worksite level discussion to implement the plan that's been ultimately decided on. As I mentioned at the outset, any plans that are made need to be fluid and adaptable as information changes. My opinion is that, as people go back to the workplace, workplaces might think they have a great plan that's covered off everything. Once you get into that workplace, I almost guarantee that there's going to be issues that hadn't been thought of that you have to integrate into that plan. Decisions need to be made in a timely manner, and it could be for a couple of reasons. First one is there could be a loosening of restrictions where it makes sense to evolve what's happening in the workplace a little bit, or it could be a second wave of the pandemic, or a tightening of restrictions, where what we thought was happening, that's changed. We need to follow the new guidelines to protect the people in the workplace. So we need to be flexible and fluid that way as well. And as well, there's new information and guidance as we gain a better understanding of the virus itself. A good example of that would be, I was reading a report last week or early this week that kind of outlined how what we originally thought about the virus and spreading through contact surfaces is a little bit different now than what we originally understood around the virus. So there's constantly evolving new information coming out that we need to be aware of, we need to follow, and we need to take into consideration when we evaluate our plan. So there's a question that I'd like to pause and throw out to the group. What I'd like you to do is respond via the question submission that we had been using to this point. So the question is for the group and those participating as attendees. Within your own workplace, what are areas do you see that need consideration? In your workplaces, what do you think needs to change in order for you to reintegrate back into that workplace safely in light of the pandemic that is still going on? A quick example as questions are generating around that is the example of casino, like the Casino Regina and Casino Moose Jaw. I've been working with those locals a little bit, and it's been interesting to me because I like playing cards with my friends, those kinds of things. So evaluating that kind of workplace and those kinds of hazards in that workplace, how is a workplace like that going to reopen and reopen safely for those employees? In a casino setting, you've got cards changing hands constantly. You've got chips changing hands constantly. You've got strangers sitting in close proximity to each other, on a consistent basis. How is that going to work? How is that going to function in the new realities that we're facing around the pandemic? So I'll leave that question with people for a couple moments as I'm going to continue going through my slides, and we'll come back once some responses have been generated and see what the attendees have come up with. The whole concept of pre-screening, I think this is going to be really prevalent and relevant in a number of our workplaces. So this could be for visitors and it could be for staff when they're entering the workplace. And it could be a series of questions, or it could be taking temperatures of people to see if they fit within some of the parameters around the virus. So on the right-hand side, there's a quick little photo I took at Costco the other day with their guidelines. You can read through it, but my genuine hope would be that workplaces are more stringent than that they aren't leaving the decision up to the people entering the building for their own consideration, those kinds of things, that there's a hard and fast rule around when people can gain access to that workplace, whether that's staff or visitor. If there's pre-screening going on, there's a number of concerns around privacy, things like that, gathering of information that are really important to address. So the first one off the top of my head is who's going to gather this information? My recommendation is if workplaces are doing this and they're doing it to staff, that needs to be from somebody from human resources or labor relations doing that sort of work. And the reason for that is because they should understand privacy matters, how to handle information, how to treat information confidentially, and how to properly share that information with people that need to know, and not share information with people that don't need to know. Some follow-up concerns around that is, how is that information stored? Who uses this information and how is it used? In an example we'll go through in the next slide, we'll look at an actual workplace and evaluate what they're doing in their workplace. And the question that workplaces will have to figure out too is, what are they going to do if somebody, whether that's a staff or visitor, refused to participate in that pre-screening? My guess is that's going to happen. If it's not from staff, it's probably going to be from a visitor. If you're dealing with the public, how is the employer, how is the workplace going to enforce that screening to protect the health and safety of those in the workplace? Is it going to be zero tolerance, where if you did not participate in that screening, you don't gain access to the building? Or is it going to be, more of an honor system like Costco? Hopefully, we're erring more to the side of, the zero tolerance, but there's going to be that wide range of approaches between employers and workplaces. This next slide is a really good example. This is from the Royal Canadian Mint, both in Winnipeg and Ottawa. They've got a list of 8 questions here, along with taking the temperatures of each and every person reporting for work. Their facilities have been running on a continual basis, even through the pandemic. So as people report to work, they're asked these 8 questions and asked, to take their temperature too. Question I've been getting a lot is, do you have to tell your employer whether if you've been exposed or potentially exposed to the COVID-19 virus? The response I've gotten from legal counsel on that is yes, you do. You have to tell the employer if there's a probable case or probable contact. You have to let the employer know. And the rationale around that is the employer has a responsibility to protect each and every person in that workplace around a potential exposure. So that responsibility, it almost supersedes a person's privacy issues that may come up with some of these questions. I've got a little bit of concern with the wording around number 8 for this workplace, and I've been talking to the workplace and the employer around some of those concerns. But still, an example of what one workplace is doing and what I anticipate other workplaces will be doing whenever they start looking at that reintegration into the workplace. Around personal protective equipment and workplace modifications. My recommendation is workplaces should be determining now what supplies and modifications are needed. As I said at the outset, I know a number of departments and workplaces are already having those conversations, even though they don't know when they're returning to work. That's great. You want to start that planning now. You don't want to do everything, rush at the last minute kind of thing. You want to have a solid plan with the ability to adjust as information comes out. And again, any determination must be done in consultation with the committee or representative, as well as the local executive as well. There's a legal responsibility to consult the committee on those or the representative on those. Also going to be all sorts of different workplace modifications in our new reality of workplaces. So this could be creating space or barriers for interaction with the public that also must be identified. Best example I can give around that is, grocery stores and banks. If you've had to go into, one of those areas, last little while, you'll see they've all got plexiglass. They've all got a procedure in between visitors and clients that they go through to protect the health and safety of the people in that workplace and the people that come in. So I think, especially in workplaces where there's interaction with the public, border services officers, casinos, Service Canada offices, there's going to be a lot of modifications that are needed in workplaces. Workplace modifications also might be a change in scheduling. It could be, you're only going into the workplace 1 or 2 days a week on staggered shifts, so that you're creating a natural widening of number of workplaces and space in that workplace. So you don't have everybody in that workplace in the same day. I can foresee a lot of workplaces taking on some modifications where certain people go in on certain days. Also might be changing start and finish times as a workplace modification, or break periods fluctuating so that everybody's not on break at the same time or lunch at the same time. Might also be a situation where lunchrooms are closed because that's a really hard area to manage. Multiple contact surfaces, those kinds of things. But the workplace modification might be just a closing off of the lunch area with a plan to, for people to have their lunch and their breaks outside of that lunchroom. And then any actions that take must be risk appropriate. They have to match the risk in the workplace. So, if you're coming in close contact with somebody, you need more protections to protect people. If there's lesser interactions, then those precautions are going to be less. A couple other fun slides here. Let's look at the first guy. I've got a couple suggestions for this guy. First one is, instead of those pool filters going up at a 90-degree angle, I think he missed an opportunity, and he should have had those pool filters going out. So it would have provided some safety around social distancing, physical distancing kind of things. So I think that was a missed opportunity there. And he's also kind of minimized his personal protective equipment by drilling 4 holes in the top. Probably not the best solution there. The middle couple, I'll give them some credit there. They thought outside the box a little bit. They used the wings and the adhesive of that product to help them provide some sort of protective equipment. They made an attempt. Let's give them some credit here. And then the last slide, my suggestion around that would be, if your workplace has provided you personal protective equipment, wear it all the time, wear it properly. Don't have it on top of your head. Don't do what's driving me crazy right now as as I see in the public, where people have the masks under their chin or exposing their nose. If you're going to wear the protective equipment, wear it properly, please. Tracy, did you have any comments around that? No. Okay, so let's go back to Tracy and we'll find out what we've got for some of the responses to the questions that I left with the attendees a little bit earlier.
Lots of answers. It was fantastic. Lots of common themes. So I'm going to paraphrase a few here. But definitely, social distancing is going to be difficult in call center environments. So there's concern when you have this whole, Office 2.0, how are they going to mask out, 8 feet when your cubicles are closer than that? When you have multiple workplaces that are using like different levels, different floors are all using the same elevators, may not all be federal public service workers in that building. Are others going to be as strict with their rules as will, federal employers if it's a federal building, as an example? Who's screening employees coming through? And then there's also the concern about screening of clients and how honest will clients be if they're trying to gain access to services. Lunchrooms is a big one. There's too many members, not enough space, like Clint mentioned. Elevators aren't large enough to have more than 2 people in them. What's that going to look like from getting to and from work? Large office buildings or large industrial buildings have old ventilation systems, right? The air is pulled from one floor to the other. How is that going to look? Face-to-face contact when you look at service centers, parole, institutions, those who have requirement to be in vehicles. 2 people in the vehicle, small, tight, confined space. No way that they're going to be able to distance and be 6 feet apart. Some of the logistics going in and out of places like labs. We also have concerns about the actual cleaners that are being used for all this additional sanitation. What does that look like for some people and what types of cleaners will be used? That's just a handful of some of the information that was provided. There's lots here. Lots and lots.
Yeah, and I think, kind of touching on a couple of topics, like the call centers are going to be a real tough one. I don't think they're going to go back, at 100% strength. There needs to be some sort of plan. I've seen some floor plans in some models where it almost looks like a checkerboard, where instead of every cubicle being open and available, it's like every second or third, and then on the other side, staggered that way. That's going to be part of the plan that the workplaces will have to work out with their own floor plan that makes best for the work that needs to be done, those kinds of things. Evaluating where teleworking can happen, that continue to happen. And as I mentioned before, lunchrooms I know are going to be a big thing. And what I can foresee is some workplaces saying, you know what, we can't manage that. We can't schedule people in and out of that. So we're just going to close access to that for the time being. So I foresee that being a solution. What was one of the other ones? And then general proximity, like especially if you're dealing with the public. I think there's going to be a lot of changes to how we do that face-to-face interaction, minimizing that face-to-face interaction if you're a parole officer, for example. And then when you do, that there's actual, modifications to the workplace, new barriers set up, those kinds of things. In the car scenario, maybe there's an opportunity for that not to happen, avoiding those situations altogether and those potential exposures where you can't maintain that 6 feet of distancing. Maybe that practice needs to stop while those social distancing measures are in place.
And Clint, just before you go on, there's one that I just was going through them again, and one that popped up a couple times I forgot to mention was the actual transportation to work for those that take public transit.
Yeah, that was the other one I was thinking of that I had to comment on. Yeah. So some of the workplace plans that I've seen and I've had a chance to review, one of the common themes is they look at the workplace and the work plan and the floor plan, those kinds of things. What the employers haven't done in their plans that I've seen is address how people are getting to work. Are they taking public transit? Are they driving? If they're in a shared building with other tenants, those kinds of things, shared elevators, shared doorways, shared washrooms. The majority of workplaces plans that I've seen to this point haven't addressed those kinds of concerns. So that would be a real flag for me the employer needs to look at those as well as part of their plan. And they haven't been to this point. And absolutely valid concerns that people would have. Okay. So outside of some of those suggestions, there's a couple of added concerns around that I would raise. First one that comes to my mind is, what if there's a scenario where part of the workplace plan is you need these barriers, you need these workplace modifications, you need this personal protective equipment, but the workplace can't get it? Whether that's a supply shortage or a labor shortage for making those workplace renovations. A number of workplaces are all going to be trying to accomplish the same thing in a short period of time, get the same supplies in a short period of time. What's going to be the workplace plan and the workplace procedure if the workplace can't get that protective equipment, can't get those modifications that have been deemed necessary. You know, is there going to be right to refuse situations in circumstances like that if the employer wants to push people back to work without those protections? You know, probably pretty likely. Next question I raised a little bit earlier, but what's the employer going to do if either a staff or a visitor refuses to wear the protective equipment or respect safety precautions? That could be the physical distancing. That could be, you know, proper hand washing, hand sanitizing before working, those sorts of things. One of the other things that the employer will need to figure out is, you know, some common areas, you know, photocopiers, supply rooms, those kinds of things. How is the employer going to manage those types of areas where people need to have access to that, where they share equipment? The employer is going to need to figure out how to work around that kind of stuff to minimize any potential exposures. And then, you know, a question I'll throw out there too is, even in the poll we did at the outset, there was a number of people that were, you know, expectedly really hesitant and really nervous and fearful about returning back to work. So a suggestion I would make is, if somebody is really nervous or fearful about going back to work, that is absolutely reasonable and absolutely foreseeable. Does it make sense for a workplace to reintegrate people that do feel comfortable reporting back to the workplace with proper precautions in place? And then having a bit of a test run to see how that works for those people that feel comfortable, have the opportunity to provide feedback, to address any issues. So to alleviate any concerns with people that people might have in returning back to the workplace. So any potential issues are addressed before they ever come back. One of the kind of conundrums that workplaces might deal with is legitimate concerns like actual health and safety concerns, potential exposures around, you know, the worries, the what if kind of situation. You know, what if this plan fails? You know, what if somebody uses that common bathroom that you know, has the virus, those kinds of things. What we really need to look at and weed out is looking at what the employer has control over and what they don't have control over. You know, they have control over the workplace. They have control over the sanitation of that workplace. They have control over the workplace practices and procedures, those kinds of things. They don't have as much control over, you know, public transit, you know, outside the building, those kinds of things. So we really need to be cognizant of focusing in on what the employer has control over. Doesn't absolve the employer from their obligation, but it certainly minimizes their ability to impact that kind of thing. And if we're going to prioritize a little bit, let's prioritize on focusing on what the employer does have control over, then look at some of those concerns that the employer does not have control over. Not going to touch on this one too much, but what's going to happen in all of our workplaces, within all of our committees, is looking at the current policies, reevaluating, updating what the policies are in place. A couple of reasons for that. Most importantly, nobody was prepared for this pandemic. No one workplace can tell me that they were prepared for this pandemic and had a policy in place that fully covered off everything that people are dealing with right now. Every workplace has an area of improvement that they can update their policy so we can learn from. And a really good, really good opportunity to learn as you go as well. And it's also going to be important if for future pandemics, or subsequent waves. If there's a second wave of the virus, and the pandemic, how is the employer going to react and learn from what they've gone through prior? And then again, a reminder that there must be participation and a consultation of the proper committee that must take place. In the federally regulated workplaces, there's usually national policy committees that will look at those policies and make recommendations at a national level. If you were going to have a workplace that doesn't have a policy committee in place, then that will fall on the health and safety committee or the health and safety representative. Good example of that is provincial legislation where there is no reference to policy committees. That would fall on the health and safety committee or the health and safety representative to take part and be consulted and participate in updating those policies. The big one, the one that I'm sure a lot of questions are coming out about is the whole concept of the duty to accommodate. So a workplace could have an absolute fabulous comprehensive plan that's going to work well for getting people reintegrated back into the workplace, but you're still going to have people with accommodation issues that need to be taken into consideration. Off the top of my head, as a rough estimate, my guess is there's going to be about 25% of our workplace that are going to be potentially in a duty to accommodate situation. That's going to create a lot of work for the employer. That's going to create a lot of work for local representatives, shop stewards, local executive, and that's going to create a lot of concern and nervousness and apprehension about returning back to work. So some of those duty accommodate situations might be on family status. As Martha mentioned at the outset, daycares aren't fully open yet. Schools are opening on a fluctuating basis. There might be elder care involved. The individual employee might have a diagnosed medical condition or be put in a high-risk category, or they may be living with somebody with a diagnosed medical condition in a high-risk category that needs to be taken into consideration. And I'm imagining that number is going to be quite high. With any duty to accommodate situation, has to be flexibility, openness, and consideration of needs. The employer needs to be flexible on what, how they meet those restrictions, those limitations. The employee themselves has to be open to trying different things and suggestions that are made that don't interfere with those limitations or restrictions. And there has to be a consideration of needs on both ends, or actually all ends, from the employee perspective, from the employer perspective, and the union representative perspective. There's that tripartite system that goes into the duty to accommodate situation. And the last bullet there I'm going to really expand on is each of these must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Everybody has different concerns, different situations going on, different prognoses, different workplace setups. Each of these duty to accommodate situations has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Really hard to do on a group basis, even within a workplace setting. So I'm going to imagine there's tons of questions around the duty to accommodate situation. What I don't want to do is deal with these in this open forum. I haven't had a chance to look through the questions as I've been talking, but I'm going to guess there's lots of concerns coming forward around individual needs, because that's been coming up in other webinars as well. But here's my suggestion on how we're going to deal with that. So if you look at the handouts, again, if you can't access those handouts, that's fine. We're going to post those to the Prairie's website afterwards so you can access. But there's a duty to accommodate guide. That guide is a fabulous guide, just got updated a few months ago. That will answer a lot of questions, address a lot of concerns around duty to accommodate situation, whether it's a medical condition or family status, anything around the accommodation process. Does a really good job of addressing some of those concerns in an easy to follow format. So what I'm going to suggest is, if you're one of those individuals on this webinar that has a question around the accommodation process, have a read over that handout. If you have any questions about the accommodation process, contact your local, contact me, your component, contact your regional office, or contact me directly, and we'll help advise you on how to best address your accommodation issue. If after reading that guide, you need some workplace action, you need some workplace resolution, then, as I said at the outset, you need to contact somebody within your local, you need to contact somebody within your component to address that specific workplace issue. They have the ability to determine how workplaces operate. So that hopefully that kind of addresses the case-by-case basis stuff. I know, like, a large part of my job lately has been addressing a lot of accommodation issues. People genuinely fearful about returning to work, what it's going to look like, those kinds of things. And unfortunately, I don't feel comfortable like putting somebody on the spot, trying to tell us, what their accommodation issue and what their human rights issue is in this kind of forum. But what I do want to do is assure people that we do have a process set up. So if you do need help, it's going to be there for you. And then some final thoughts before we, go to our wrap up there. So some final thoughts are, we need to begin plans now. A lot of workplaces are already doing that. Fabulous. That's what you want to do. The work needs to continue to be done remotely where it's possible to do that. Just because we're looking at reintegration into the workplace doesn't mean people should stop teleworking. That's the best way to protect people from potential exposures. That's what should continue happening. If there's any at-risk positions, obvious examples, Casino Regina, Casino Moose Jaw, Border Services, Service Canada, parole offices, CFA inspectors, those kinds of things. Those at-risk positions need to be identified and made a priority for any plans, any PPE, any modifications, those kinds of things. Generally speaking, we need to change the way we do business. We all got comfortable in our jobs. We've learned a lot in the past few months, and we need to look at how to do things differently, limiting face-to-face interactions as much as possible, either within coworkers or visitors, clients, those kinds of things. Avoiding large meetings where we can, people working in closed spaces where we can, those kinds of things. Another important thing is, because nobody has gone through this before, we need to learn from other workplaces and what they're doing, sharing information, experiences, and adapt as we go along. Because nobody has experience in how to do this, and almost every workplace is learning as they go along. So if we learn from what some workplaces are doing that works, we evaluate how we can make that and implement that in our workplaces. Good example of that is even within the federal government, where the government guidance and the provincial guidance is based on what other pieces of legislation are doing. The federal government and the provinces are looking at the United States and seeing what's not working and saying, hey, we need to do something different than they're doing to make sure that we're protecting everyone. And then most importantly, we need to continue to practice and enforce physical distancing and other protective measures. Even though we're in a situation where, restrictions are being loosened, we're looking at potential, return to work situations and reintegration into the workplace. We see more and more businesses opening, those kinds of things. There's a tendency to kind of ease off. My last reminder is we need to continue to practice physical distancing and protective measures to ensure ourselves and everyone else around us is safe. So with that, that's kind of what I've got as my presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing some questions and doing my best to answer them.
Thank you very much, Clint. Appreciate it. I'm just going to ask Marianne to kind of join us on screen here as I just run through a couple of things. We are going to go to the questions that there's been a few obviously that have come in. I just want to make a couple of sort of announcements, so to speak. This webinar will be shared and it's going to be put onto the PSAC Prairies webpage. So the presentation, the handouts, and the recording will all be available. So please share them in your workplace. Share them with an executive member, share them with a colleague who you think might find this beneficial, because we want to reach as many folks as we can. Also, just wanted to let you know that you're going to be getting an email tomorrow with some follow-up information. It's going to have a survey. It's going to have a link for our next webinar, which happens to be Thursday, June 4th. So here's a shameless plug for pension, an overview of how the Federal Public Service Pension Plan works. Learn about your pension, your benefits, what are the contributions, the rates, the monthly benefits, the formula, and indexing. So that's Thursday, June 4th. You can actually register on the PSAC Prairies website. Like I said, it'll be on your follow-up email that you receive as well. So I just want to make mention that we couldn't get to all the questions because, there was a lot that came in, and like Clint said, a lot of the accommodation issues we won't be able to touch right now, but we do have some questions, so we're going to go ahead, and some might be more appropriate for Marianne, and for Clint, I'm going to let you fight it out on screen. Okay, Martha, over to you.
Thanks, Tracy. So yes, as you expected, Clint, there are a lot of questions that pertain to the duty to accommodate. And so you've already prefaced what people should do about that. So folks, you're not going to get a case-by-case answer to that. One interesting question that I thought would be relevant to all the callers is that we'd like to hear you talk about 699 leave and the application of 699 leave around people continuing to either work from home or gradually return to work as needed.
Yeah, so the whole concept of 699 leave, I'll jump in first and then let Marianne add to. The concept there is in the federal public service, they've got this coding that should apply to any situation that's COVID related. And then reviewing the Treasury Board language as well as the guidance provided by PSAC. If there's a situation where somebody tests positive and they need to self-isolate, that's when the leave should be used. If they have a potential exposure and they can't attend work, that 699 leave should be used. If they're in a situation where they have childcare concerns, where they can't report to work because of or work at all because of childcare concerns, that's when that 699 leave should be used. I know there's been a bit of a change around the employer's application of that in certain departments, but from my understanding, that's when it should be when that sort of leave should be used.
Excellent. Thanks, Clint.
Yeah,
Sorry,
Martha,
sorry,
I'm just gonna, I'm just gonna add in on that. I know that a lot of departments, we have managers who are trying to call people back to work, who are saying, okay, June 1st, you got to come back to work. And what I can say is, throughout the week on my regular calls with the National Board of Directors and the Executive Committee and the National President, the policy around 699 has not changed. So if employers are in fact trying to get people back to work where the Health and Safety Committee doesn't have a plan, and Treasury Board has not approved a returning, a reintegration policy yet either. So departments are talking about it, but they have no guidelines that they have to adhere to, which means that it's not business as usual. So if your employer is saying you need to get back to work, then you need to contact your local. And if you're in a component, which if you're with the federal government, you will be, you need to let your component know, because as we're seeing pockets of this happen, the national president is having that conversation directly with Treasury Board. But for right now, nothing has changed on 699. That doesn't mean they're not trying.
Perfect. Thanks, Marianne. So another big theme, a ton of questions pertain to, too many people in too small a space, like the whole workplace 2.0. And I know you were sort of addressing that in another part of your presentation, Clint, but there's a really interesting question I'd like you to address first, and that is the concern around being exposed in the course of doing your job. So we have a couple of members that work for the RCMP in offices where the RCMP members are traveling to remote areas where there's a very high incidence of COVID cases. And then another member responded with a concern about what happens if I get exposed when I am handling client or customer documents. So when they're submitting paperwork to you that they've touched.
Yeah, so the first question I would kind of ask, if that member approached me with those questions and those concerns is, what's being done right now in place? What's in place now to protect against those potential exposures? If somebody's handling papers, what protections are in place for somebody that's handling those papers? What is the employer determined as the process in consultation with the committee that how that should be done and done safely? My guess is if people are bringing those concerns forward, that the employer hasn't done an adequate job, that there's still concerns on the part of the employee to do that. And no matter what job is being done, it needs to be done safely. There needs to be a hazard analysis done of that work being done. So there's certain work that has to be done, you know, for the safety of the country. And we see a number of different workplaces do that, such as the RCMP. But that does not limit the employer's responsibility to protect the people in that workplace as much as reasonably practicable. So I would have all sorts of questions around, okay, what's in the workplace? What else should the employer be doing in that circumstance? If the employer is not meeting those needs and refusing to meet those needs and not being open to suggestions on protection, is it then an opportunity to refuse that part of the work that's being done in order to protect the health and safety of the people in those workplaces?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to actually go hopefully to someone who's on the line. Just going to ask Carol if she's willing to ask or ready to ask her question. Carol was actually the first person to ask a question tonight, so I'll just unmute you here, Carol, if you want to unmute yourself, if you're still wanting to ask your question live. She's like, no way. She's muted herself.
In front of hundreds of people. That's okay.
Yeah, yeah. It's only it's down a couple. It's down a few. So.
Well, the first one we did, I was like, you know, there was like over 1,000 people on the webinar that we did, and I'm like, I tried not to imagine 1,000 people in the room as I'm talking, kind of thing. It's really, you know, kind of a, you know, it made me feel uncomfortable. You know, I'm thinking, you know, like there's some bands out there that don't even get 1,000 people listening to them perform. That, you know, it was a little, you know, a little daunting to be sure.
Well, Carol hasn't unmuted herself, so maybe she doesn't think I'm talking about her.
Okay.
So I'm just going to ask her question then.
Okay.
So she's wanting to know specifically, and this is maybe a more of a Marianne question, is about layoffs. You know, everyone's been working from, a lot of people have been working from home. You know, some have not been so lucky, and there have been layoffs. So the question is, have there been any layoffs? And if so, how many? Is there any sort of an anticipation that there might be some more? What are we looking at down the road?
Well, that's an excellent question. So what I can say for the Treasury Board in our federal agencies, we've seen 0 layoffs. And at the national level, we are tracking layoffs. So, you know, we get, I don't have it in front of me, but I can tell you that that number remains 0. So the federal government has done their part, not laid people off, continue to pay them and find ways for them to do that. That, unfortunately, is not the situation for many of our members. While the majority of our members are federal government, we have seen some significant layoffs in the airport sector here in the prairies, Calgary, Regina, Winnipeg shortly, Edmonton shortly. Now, some have utilized the employer wage subsidy. So Calgary actually laid off about 100 people, brought a bunch back under the subsidy, and extended that until that program is over, and then they most likely will be laid off. We have seen, of course, Christina Regina, which is a Crown Corporation in Regina, all but about 20 of the close to 400 members were laid off temporarily. We have seen, you know, it's not over. You know, the reality is it's not over yet. So we anticipate there could possibly be even more coming. So as much as, you know, we're fighting for 699 and we're working to make sure that Treasury Board is keeping people on, we're also working really, really hard on all the other units that unfortunately are profit-based. And those employees, some are temporary layoffs, but we're seeing a lot of permanent layoffs as
Okay, thank you, Marianne. This is almost a kind of a follow-up question. It is a different type of question, but so if somebody is working from home currently and they're being asked to go back into the office, everyone has different issues. So it might be an immune compromised family member. It could be a child with a disability or behavioral issues, which makes working from home difficult with small children. And if they're being asked to go back to work and they can't go back to work and their employees telling them that they have to, what is their process for, and I know you talked about the right to refuse and didn't really want to get into a lot of it, Clint, but what is someone's process for questioning, is there other options for them? Because that's come up several times as well.
Well, I think the first question or area of clarification I would have is, have they explored the issue through a duty to accommodate situation and the employer's obligation to accommodate that specific issue that's based on one of those prohibited grounds that's covered under the human rights legislation? So not looking at it from a right to refuse situation, but looking at it from the employer's obligation to deal with that person on a case-by-case basis with their particular needs. My guess is that that hasn't been done, or that hasn't been done completely, that we need to fully explore that accommodation process for that individual. Because I said, you know, the plan that the employee comes up with, or the needs of the workplace, they might be applicable to 75, 80% of the people, but there still needs to be a process to deal with all those one-off situations that are legitimate, that need to be looked at a case-by-case basis. So I'd first evaluate if the situation's been dealt with as an accommodation issue, as opposed to going right to that refuse. That might come up at a later date, but the first question I would have, and the suggestion I would make, is follow that accommodation process, because that's where it ideally falls under. Marianne, it sounds like you want to hop in.
Yeah, well, I also want to say that on some of the stuff, like we keep using the word unprecedented, and I think the amount of times we use the word unprecedented is unprecedented. But the reality is some managers don't know what to do with this. And so, you know, they're getting pressure and they're putting pressure. So, you know, in some instances, yes, it might be an accommodation issue, and that absolutely needs to be dealt with. But my suggestion is make sure that your local knows what managers are saying, and that, you know, that information is communicated to the components. Because I will tell you that, you know, as soon as you get a bunch of idiot managers in one workplace trying to force things, all it takes is for the national component president to phone the director general or whatever, and it is clarified that that position is you know, that person went a little too far. So, you know, the main intent in all of these conversations is to minimize the risk. It's not about, you know, filing a grievance and winning a grievance and doing all this other stuff. Sometimes the quickest thing to do is say, like, is anyone else having this problem, or is anyone else being asked to provide this information or to do this, that, or the other thing? And if it seems like, you know, somebody's going rogue and trying to make a name for themselves, make sure that information is communicated up to the union, because the component presidents are constantly feeding information to our national president, Chris Elward, and Chris literally meets with Treasury Board. Well, it was daily when this started, but it's like twice a week now at least. You know, he had a 2-hour call with them this afternoon. So make sure somebody knows that's happening versus trying to fight this on your own, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and then just to kind of reaffirm that, like when you're using the accommodation process, that there's 3 parties there. There's the employee, the employer, and the union. So that's the opportunity where the union shouldn't be involved at those initial discussions. And if they need to carry it forward to their component or their component national president, then there's the opportunity to do that. My strong suggestion would be that the union be involved at that first level. And that's why I said, you know, during my presentation, I expect local representatives to be a lot busier representing people with these sorts of concerns, just for the reasons Marianne mentioned.
Hello, everyone. So we've kind of wrapped up most of the questions that we could ask. It's 8:30, so I just wanted to thank Clint for the presentation and also Martha for the presentation and the work on the webinar. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. Marianne, I just want to maybe ask if you have any kind of closing remarks before we head out. And just before we do, I want to remind everyone that they should be going on to the PSAC website and updating their contact information. We want a home email address from you. So that was my reminder.
So before I give Marianne last word, because I always give her last word, just a reminder, I know we breezed over the duty to accommodate stuff. If you have any questions or concerns about how it works or want any guidance or support, absolutely feel free to contact me and I can direct you in the right way, provide some guidance. But again, if you need any workplace resolution, have to go through the local or the opponent, and that's what I would tell you in those circumstances. So that's it for me. Thanks, Marianne.
Okay, well, thanks again. You know, as we mentioned before, each of the regional offices in the prairies is taking turns kind of hosting a webinar. And, you know, I happen to think that we're really getting into a groove here, and we are the envy of some others. And so I do want to thank you for the information. I think this was timely. And, you know, if you have suggestions for webinars, we do have them scheduled till the end of June. We don't know what the fall is going to look like. So, you know, there's an opportunity to continue. This is really something that we do for the members. Like, this is for you. So if, you know, if you have ideas, please let us know. If you have feedback, you know, good feedback is always great. But if you have some ways that we can do this better, we want to hear from you. You know, for the most part, we want to make sure that our members are safe in their communities, whether you're working from home, whether you're in the workplace. And we are doing everything we can at every single level to try to do that. But we can't help you if we're not communicating. So that's the purpose of doing this. And that's why we've got staff giving their evenings up. And I want to thank all of them. I want to thank all of you. And yeah, federal superannuation next week. So if you're under the federal pension plan, superannuation, I think you'll find next week really interesting. And yeah, thank you and have a great evening.